She was the youngest self-made female billionaire on the planet, worth $4.5 billion, on the cover of every magazine, and compared to Steve Jobs and Einstein in the same breath. Presidents took her calls. The most powerful men in America sat on her board, and every drop of it was built on a machine that didn't work. This is a company that was once worth $9 billion, a company that promised to do something miraculous, run hundreds of medical tests on a single drop of blood from your finger. No big needles, no vials, and you can detect cancer, diabetes, and infections early enough to save your life, just from one tiny prick. But there was just one problem. The machine couldn't do it. It never could, and the woman at the top, she knew this. But this isn't like the other stories I've told you. WeWork wasted money. Wirecard stole it. This one's darker. Because when this fraud failed, it didn't just cost people their savings. Real sick patients got real blood test results. Results telling them whether they had cancer, whether they were having a miscarriage, or whether they were dying. And those results were wrong. I'm going to show you how a 19-year-old Stanford dropout fooled some of the smartest, most powerful people in the world for over a decade. How she faked the demonstrations, hid commercial machines behind a curtain, and silenced anyone who tried to stop her, and how it finally came crashing down, sending her to a federal prison cell where she sits right now to this day. This is the story of Theranos, and this is Storynomics. Her name is Elizabeth Holmes, and to understand how she pulled this off, you have to understand that she wasn't selling a product, she was selling a character. In 2003, at 19, Holmes dropped out of Stanford University to start a blood testing company, and from the very beginning, she built a persona almost too perfect to be real. She wore a black turtleneck every single day. Yes, exactly like Steve Jobs, she trained herself to speak an unusually deep, slow baritone voice. She rarely blinked. She told a story about being terrified of needles, which made her mission sound personal, emotional, and human. The pitch was intoxicating. Imagine a small box. She called it the Edison, sitting in every pharmacy, eventually every home. You prick your finger, one drop of blood goes in, and it runs hundreds of tests. Cheaper, faster, and painless. It would, she said, democratize healthcare. Catch diseases before they killed you. It was a beautiful vision, and the most powerful people in America fell in line behind it. Look at the board that she assembled. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. George Shultz, another former Secretary of State. 2 former US cabinet members, the former CEO of Wells Fargo, a retired 4-star general, James Mattis, who later became Secretary of Defense. This was one of the most powerful boards in American corporate history. But here's the thing that almost nobody noticed. Not one of them was a doctor. Not one of them was an expert in blood science. They were titans of politics and war, dazzled by a young woman with a world-changing story. And the money poured in from some of the richest people in America. The Walton family, the heirs of Walmart, put in around $150 million. Media mogul Robert Murdoch, around $125 million. Betsy DeVos and her family, another $100 million. All in all, investors poured close to $1 billion into Theranos. By 2014, Theranos was valued at $9 billion, and Elizabeth Holmes, on paper, was worth around $4.5 billion. There was just one tiny detail standing between Elizabeth Holmes and immortality. The Edison machine didn't work, and to hide that, she was about to cross a line that turns this from a business scandal into something genuinely dangerous. So how do you sell a miracle machine that doesn't function? You fake it. And the way Theranos faked it is almost hard to believe. When investors or partners came for a demo, Holmes would have them prick their finger, drop the blood into an Edison, and watch it whir into life. What they didn't know is that in many cases the machine wasn't actually analysing their blood at all. It would run, display an animation, and then produce a result. But behind the scenes, the company had engineered it to hide errors and show a normal-looking reading. The demo was theatre. It wouldn't ever show a health fault. It got worse. When Theranos actually needed to produce real blood tests, it couldn't even use the Edison at all, because it didn't work. So secretly, the company bought commercial blood testing machines from a rival company, Simmons, the same ordinary machines any normal lab uses. They hid them in a back room, ran the patient's blood on those, and then reported the results as if their magical Edison had produced them. Now, here's the catch. Because a finger prick only gives a tiny amount of blood, too little for those commercial machines, they would dilute the samples with saline to make them go further. And diluting a blood sample makes the results less accurate. So think about that. To protect the lie that their technology needed only a drop of blood, they were degrading the very test that sick people were depending on. Now here's where the company stopped being a Silicon Valley curiosity and became a genuine danger, because in 2013, Theranos struck a deal with Walgreens and started offering these tests to the actual public, real patients walking into pharmacies and trusting Theranos with their health. And the results, internal testing would later show, were an absolute disaster. By one account, the Edison device only got 12 out of 100 patient samples right. 12%. People received results telling them how they might be having a heart attack when they weren't. A woman was told she might be miscarrying. Patients got alarming readings about HIV, about cancer markers, about their hormone levels, readings that were simply false. Real people made real medical decisions based on the number that came from a fraud. There was no longer a story about money. It was a story about a company gambling with human lives. Inside that company, a handful of young employees were starting to realise what they were a part of and what it might cost them to say so. The first cracks didn't come from investigators or regulators. They came from inside. From people in their early 20s, barely out of college, who were brave enough to do what billionaires and statesmen would not. One of them was named Tyler Schultz, and his story is almost unbelievable, because Tyler wasn't just any employee. His grandfather was George Schultz, the former Secretary of State who sat on the Theranos board and adored Elizabeth Holmes like family. Tyler joined Theranos full of belief, but on the lab floor he saw the truth. The diluted samples, the failed quality control tests, the machines that simply didn't work. He saw the company manipulating data, throwing out results it didn't like to make the numbers look better. He emailed Elizabeth Holmes directly with his concerns. He was dismissed. So he resigned. And then it got personal. Tyler reached out, secretly, using a burner phone he bought with cash, to a Wall Street Journal reporter named John Carreyrou, who was independently pulling at the same thread. Another young whistleblower, a scientist named Erica Chung, took her concerns to the regulators. Theranos fought back with everything it had. The company is reported to have spent around $150,000 on private investigators to follow the whistleblowers. Tyler was threatened with lawsuits that could have financially destroyed him, and the pressure split his own family apart. His grandfather, loyal to Holmes, was reportedly furious with him after talking to the press. Imagine that. A 22-year-old being followed by private investigators, threatened with ruin, and turning his own grandfather against him because he refused to stay quiet about people getting sick with fake results. There was an even darker cost. A senior Theranos scientist named Ian Gibbons, a brilliant biochemist who had grown deeply distressed about what was happening inside of the company. He died by suicide in 2013, under the weight of the pressure and looming legal battles. A man's life was lost in the machinery of this deception. And still, for a while, the lie held. Because who do you believe? A handful of 20-somethings or Henry Kissinger, a $9 billion valuation and a magnetic founder on the cover of every magazine? But the truth, once it's out, has a way of pulling everything down with it. In October 2015, John Carreyrou in the Wall Street Journal published the story that broke Theranos open. The technology didn't work. The company was using commercial machines and the results were unreliable. Holmes went on television and angrily denied all of it, calling the doubters people who didn't understand what she was building. But by now, the dam had cracked. Regulators moved in, and when inspectors examined the Theranos lab, they concluded conditions there posed, in their words, an immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. Theranos was forced to void or correct tens of thousands of blood test results. Tens of thousands. Every one a real person who had trusted a number that was never real. Walgreens cut ties and sued. The partnership collapsed. That $9 billion valuation evaporated to nothing. in 2018, the government charged Holmes and her partner, Theranos President Sunny Balwani, who was also secretly her boyfriend, with massive fraud. The Theranos shut its doors for good. The miracle was over. And then came the reckoning that other people in these stories never quite faced, because here's what makes Theranos different. Elizabeth went on trial, and in January 2022, a jury found her guilty of 4 counts of fraud. She was sentenced to more than 11 years in federal prison. Her partner, Sunny Balwani, got nearly 13. They were ordered to pay $452 million in restitution. She appealed and lost. The conviction was upheld. As things stand, Elizabeth Holmes, once the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world, is sitting in a federal prison camp in Texas, not scheduled for release until the early 2030s. The woman who was going to live forever, who built a persona engineered for immortality, is just an inmate with a number now. So what is the real story of Theranos? It was never really about a machine. It's about the same thing every time: belief. It's about how a great story, told by a magnetic person, can switch off part of a brilliant person's brain that asks the obvious question. 2 former secretaries of state, a 4-star general, a media emperor, the richest families in America, and not one of them did the simplest thing imaginable: demanded to see the machine actually work independently before handing over their reputations and their money. They didn't want proof. They wanted the story to be true. But here's the line that separates Theranos from every other fraud I've shown you. When WeWork collapsed, people lost jobs. When Wirecard collapsed, people lost money. When Theranos collapsed, the wreckage included patients who were told they were sick when they were healthy, and patients who were told they were healthy when they were sick. This is what happens when we let a beautiful story override hard evidence. Sometimes the bill isn't paid in dollars, it's paid in blood. That's the economics of a story, and that's Storynomics. So I've shown you 3 founders who sold a fantasy, and the world bought all 3. Next time, I want to show you the other side. What it actually looks like when one ordinary person refuses to believe the lie and brings an empire down. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.